If you have never heard about how the Egyptian plagues correspond to Egyptian gods, I think you'll like this presentation. It will probably stimulate your mind more than your heart, seeing God doing some apologetics in the book of Exodus. Sometimes we miss out on some of the genius points of the Bible when we know too little about the environment of the writer and of the original readers. God's point here is that all the Egyptian gods, which had been worshipped for centuries, were so inferior and powerless against the Almighty God of Moses. Before we dive into today's material, I would like to give you a short historical overview of Egypt. At about 10,000 BC, we see the people lived along the Nile. The river Nile was life-giving, as it is still today. Most of Egypt is desert. About 5500 BC, we have what is called the pre-dynastic period, where the archaeological evidence becomes more abundant. We see evidence of small settlements, organized agriculture, even larger building constructions. They were actually using mortar at this time. At 3000 BC, the first dynasties emerge. Egypt is a unified state and has a king, the pharaoh. They develop a quite advanced writing system. 2500 BC, the Great Pyramids were built, quite near Cairo, the modern capital of Egypt. At 2000 BC, Abraham visited Egypt, maybe also he saw the pyramids, I guess he would. They were antiques, they were famous, as was the Sphinx. After about 400 years of slavery, Moses was raised in Egypt. He learned all the tips and tricks at Pharaoh's court. Egypt was a world power at this time. Quite advanced culture, medicine, even brain surgery. Later, 1000 BC, King David's son, he married Pharaoh's daughter, so there was an alliance there. At 600 BC, the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, then the Persians took over Egypt for about 300 years. In 2 Kings 23, we read that Pharaoh Necho killed one of the kings of Judah. All the way through the Old Testament, there's a connection to Egypt. Egypt is actually mentioned in 30 of the Old Testament books. Then in 300 BC, Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, and there were Greek pharaohs for about 300 years, until 30 BC, when the Romans took over Egypt. So after a long time with Greek pharaohs, ending with Cleopatra, there was Roman administration over Egypt at the time when Jesus visited Egypt. There are lots of hard facts that have been dug up. Many of the amazing things produced even 5,000 years ago have survived. This can really help both our knowledge about ancient Egypt, but also to illuminate the biblical times. The same goes for other stuff in the field of biblical archaeology. Back to Exodus, that's the Greek word for departure. It's time to exit Egypt. It started with the descendants of Abraham crying out to God, and he listened, as God always does. Pharaoh was asked to let the Jews go, but he didn't want to do that. The result of his stubbornness was 10 plagues. Now, why? Well, both to answer Pharaoh's taunt, he said, "Who is this God?" and also to impress the Jews and the surrounding nations for many centuries to come, as we can read in the Old Testament. Pharaoh could have stopped all of it, but he hardened his heart, and he chose not to. Anyway, God triumphed over Pharaoh, over the Egyptian gods. Every plague was a direct insult to the gods of Egypt. And finally, they were all allowed to leave. And this has been celebrated yearly with rituals in the Jewish community. In Exodus 12:12, God is saying, "Against all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgments. I am Yahweh." So that is why he chose those 10 plagues, as we will see in a few minutes. God said he would perform wonders. Sometimes we call them plagues. God did several wonders, including the burning bush that didn't burn down, Moses' staff turning into a snake, and so on. But here we'll focus on the 10 plagues starting in Exodus 7. They have been grouped into 3 sets of 3 plagues, plus a final one. As the first in each group, that is plague number 1, 4, and 7, they came with a warning, but the last in each group, that is number 3, 6, and 9, they came without a warning. Now let's look into how the 10 plagues correspond to Egyptian gods, as Yahweh wanted to execute judgment against them. We start off with wonder number 1. Water from the Nile turned into blood. Horrible thing. Here we see Hapi, who was the god of the Nile. This was a slap in the face for him. He couldn't protect the water, and the water was the heartbeat of Egypt. Essential, both for drinking and for trade, commerce, and for crops. Also, other gods were challenged by this miracle. Osiris, the Nile was called Osiris' bloodstream. Now it turned into actual blood. Wonder number 2. Frogs came out of the river. Here we see Heket. She's always depicted with a frog's head or a frog on top of her head. Frogs were also animals you should never tramp upon or kill, because there were hard punishments for doing that in Egypt of those days. Now, frogs were not so popular anymore. Frogs were everywhere and they were dead. So that was plague number 2. Number 3, lice, especially dreadful for the priests. Lice of the dust of the earth. The priests shaved not only their beards, but also eyebrows, not to become unclean by lice. Now there were lice everywhere. And Geb was challenged and beaten by God in this wonder number 3. Wonder number 4, swarms of flies. They did not bother the Jews who lived at Goshen. God protected them. But Kepher, who was the god of beetles and flies, he couldn't protect the Egyptians. Also Amun-Ra were challenged by God on this one. Wonder number 5, death of cattle and of livestock. The herds of the Jews were not affected either. And after these 5 horrible plagues, Pharaoh tried to persuade Moses to stop it. But Pharaoh didn't want to let the Jews go. So they had wonder number 6, boils and sores. There were lots of Egyptian gods helping with medicine, with healing, magic, and so on, like Isis and Imhotep. But none of them could help the Egyptians against this plague. Wonder number 7, hail came from the sky. There are few gods who were protecting the sky, holding the sky up, and so on. Nut, who was the goddess of the sky, she was also mother of 5 other gods, but none of them could protect Pharaoh or his people. Wonder number 8, then the locust came. We have seen that several times also in modern history. Grasshoppers come and eat all the crops. Seth, the Egyptian god of crops, was powerless against God's hand. Wonder number 9, complete darkness. The major sun god, called Ra, stood helpless. Surely many prayed to him, but they had no sunlight for several days. Other sun gods also, one who raised the sun in the morning, one god of the sun rays, and so on. Obviously, none of them helped the Egyptians. Wonder number 10, and the final plague and motivation for Pharaoh to give in. Death of the firstborn. The firstborn was important in many ways, as he had a double inheritance, he had the birthright, he was also the future for your family, for your business, or whatever. So it was an awful blow against the Egyptians and against Pharaoh. Pharaoh used to be deified after death, but at this time of Moses, he was a god even while he was living. Even Pharaoh had his firstborn die. There were also a few other gods, like Hathor and Isis, who were defeated by God Yahweh. To sum up this short presentation about the gods of Egypt and how they were defeated when the God of Moses performed these 10 wonders. First we see the people crying out to God as they were oppressed by Pharaoh, and he answered them. Then God warned Pharaoh, who didn't want to listen. Pharaoh could have prevented these disasters. When the 10 miracles happened, God proved himself superior to all the Egyptian gods. They were lame and helpless. God, he fulfilled the promise to Abraham to get the Jews out of Egypt and give them their own country. And the rest, as they say, is history. Thank you for taking time out. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation, that your faith has been boosted, and that your awe of God is growing. Take care. Bye-bye.